Recently, my son Adam asked me if I knew anything about when the chapters and verses were added to the scriptures. A lot of big books have books, numbered books and chapters and sort of a section of verses divided into them. And one of the books I have is Josephus. His real name isn't Josephus. It's Yusuf ben Mattatyahu, but Yusuf is the real name, the Hebrew word for Josephus. And he was a first century historian born around the year 37 CE, and he recorded a lot of history. Now, he's not a prophet, but he is a historian. So he recorded what events, you know. And anyway, my son asked me about this. When was this done? It was done a lot over a period of time. The Latin Vulgate came about at the end of the 4th century into the early 4th century, and that was Eusebius Sophronius. And he translated mostly from the Greek Septuagint, which was a translation. Translation is an interpretation, and they used that as the first translation from the real Hebrew prophets. The Hebrew prophets comprise the books of Musha and the prophets, and when they translated these books into Greek, it gave them a language that people could read and understand and hear and understand. So but then there was always this great volume of work, and it was hard to find where things were. So I want to read to you a little background history on the various places and times and people who worked on dividing the scripture up into pieces that were manageable. So hold on, we're going to do that little spin. I'm going to show you my screen. Here it comes. All right. When was scripture divided into chapters and verses? It didn't happen all at once. To get a perspective of what, when, and who made the translated text into a searchable form, this is just a general description of how it happened. First, there was an early circus father named Marcion, and he sought to eliminate the original prophets of Scripture from Bereshith through Malachi, and he introduced the concept of Old Testament and New Testament, which is actually incorrect. This labeling continues to stick in the minds of teachers. It's not correct to think in these terms, and it's called Marcionism. The Old Covenant was animal blood. You can read that at Deuteronomy 31, verse 26. And the renewed or new covenant in Yahusha's blood is explained at Hebrews chapter 8, verse 13. That's the correct perspective. Daniel 10:21 calls the word of Yahuwah the scripture of truth. In Hebrew, that's kathab amath. Kathab is the writing, and amath is truth. Yahusha said the scripture of truth cannot be divided at Yehukanan or John 10, verse 35. He wasn't referring to chapters and verses, but rather superseding and eliminating texts to control people's beliefs. Mordecai, Nathan, divided the scripture into chapters between Bereshith or Genesis and Malachi in 1445 CE. Stephen Langton, who was another circus dude, some kind of clergyman, he divided what he called the New Testament into chapters between 1255 and 1258. Santi Pagnini, who was a monk, worked on early revisions of the Latin Vulgate. Now, the Latin Vulgate is the second translation from the original inspired texts. The inspired texts are the Hebrew texts written by the prophets themselves, and there's the scrolls. And then the Greek Septuagint is a translation, meaning it's an interpretation from that. And the Latin Vulgate was based upon the Septuagint, so it's a second-hand translation or interpretation. And Paganini divided the New Testament, as he called it, into verses. And based upon the chapters that were already established earlier, the first publication of the entire scriptures into chapters and verses was the Geneva translation in 1560. This was accomplished by a colony of Protestant scholars in exile from England who worked under the general direction of Miles Coverdale and John Knox, and under the influence of John Calvin. And I'll continue with just a little more information about how names began to change, and this was brought up as a question by another brother. These names that we read in these English translations are nothing like what they were originally, most of them. The alterations of names surely began with the Latin Vulgate. And as the Greek was the first translation from the Hebrew, the Latin Vulgate would be the logical next stage. And English followed the Latin with the English King James Version. The Greek Iacobus, that would be making his name masculine with the ending os, became the Latin Iacobus. And see, the J didn't exist because there is no J until the 16th century. And that would be late because it wasn't even, there were no J's in the first edition of the King James Version. The King James Version is Catholic, and it's specifically Anglican Catholic, and it was based upon a direct translation of the Catholic Latin Vulgate into English. The first 1611 version used Iocob for James and extracted that from the Latin Vulgate's Iacobus. His real name was Jakub. Over the centuries, the Hebrew texts were hunted down and burned to remove any evidence for future generations. But that didn't work. The Dead Sea Scrolls were stolen by Jesuit cave looters who have not yet been prosecuted for their crimes, since the scrolls were unprotected resources in 1947, the year before the State of Israel was established. Thanks for watching, and I hope this helps and you can use some of these as a means of extracting more details. But keep the commandments and be the bride. Thank you very much for listening.